For TRICHOMES.com, I'm Jesse Batend, and this is The High Ground. On this show, we feature leaders of the cannabis industry. We talk to everyone from farmers to CEOs and public officials, anyone making an impact on the cannabis community and beyond. Cannabis has been increasingly popping up in our political conversation heading into the 2020 election. There's been a lot of discussion about the potential role cannabis can play in economic recovery following the spread of COVID-19. Democratic Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi defended including cannabis-related provisions in the House's coronavirus relief package, calling cannabis a therapy that has proven successful. Then Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden picked California Senator Kamala Harris as his VP pick, and Republicans exploded with attacks against her, including for her time as a prosecutor and specifically her handling of cannabis cases. There's also been speculation about how her recent support for federal legalization may impact her running mate's position leading into November. The point is that cannabis has entered the political discussion, and it's likely not going anywhere anytime soon. But my guest today says that those in favor of federal legalization might just be talking about it all wrong. Bob Hoban is the president and founder of Hoban Law Group. Back in 2009, he was part of a team that represented a dispensary in a landmark case that successfully argued that it was unconstitutional for the Colorado city of Centennial to prevent them from operating. But Bob says, legally speaking, calling cannabis medicine, even though that was part of his legal strategy back then, is potentially not the best path forward. Today, we're talking about the language around cannabis legalization. Bob, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to talk today. I know we all wish we could be together face to face, but unfortunately, these times don't always allow it. But thanks for reaching out.
I got to ask you, you are sought after for your opinion by governments, by countries, by large businesses, but you're also coming on my podcast and talking to me about all this stuff, and you do your own podcast, so you're also giving away all of this stuff for free. Are you sure that's like a good business strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, the primary motivation for me these days, business is good. So against that backdrop, it's really just education. I really want people to understand deeply how this industry has evolved, how it's become sophisticated, how it's become professionalized, and that it's not something that you should be fearful of. And that's really the message that I hope to get out there. I think it was Jerry Garcia who said, we're like licorice. Not everybody likes licorice, but the people who like licorice really, really like licorice. And that's been the magic. People are drawn to work with people that have a vision and that want to share in the development of this industry. And that's really where it all began. So it's with great pride that, we can say that some of our earlier clients have really gone on to do really, really great things. It's with great pride that I, as a professor at the University of Denver, have helped educate people about this industry. And now that they survive and they thrive and they support their families with really meaningful positions in the development of this industry. Too many people are here for a quick buck, or to create a flash in the pan, where this industry is here to stay, and certainly my organization is as well.
So many people come to you for answers or expertise. When you were involved in really shaping so much of the nascent industry, where did you turn for guidance, for feedback on how to feel about a thing, or looking to history for kind of an example to follow?
Well, that's a great question, and I think far too many people come into this industry and they think they have all the answers. The answers are out there, but they're not easy answers. First of all, I got into this industry because my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. So I got into this industry as what was otherwise a commercial practitioner, working for a large regional firm here in the state of Colorado, understanding that my mother wanted to at least attempt to, try and see if cannabis helped her during her pancreatic cancer days. She was given 6 months to live, and through a variety of different uses, she lived for 3.5 years. And this is long before I was ever aware at a micro level of the science behind what cannabinoids can do with the human body beyond simply the pain relief and sort of that attitude adjustment element. So that was a major driver for me. And I began to meet people that were ambitious, that were risk takers, that wanted to work in this space. And oh my goodness, how that's evolved over the years is pretty remarkable. But I always look for patterns. And as the marijuana industry unfolded, we began to look at whether it was a medical regime. Then you would look to niche medical businesses that survived, whether they're pain clinics or whether they were alternative therapy clinics, looking at that as a model for medical marijuana businesses. As adult use businesses came around, we looked at patterns that evolved in the retail liquor establishments, as again, not being apples and apples, but really being instructive about how the businesses could run and would run, looking at highly regulated industries. As the industrial hemp space evolved and as CBD became as popular as it is today. And again, we're very proud to say that we were on the ground floor helping shape both the development of marijuana across this country and its industry, but also the hemp CBD industry. Well, the CBD industry, that was the easiest one of all. That was a very good friend of mine named Chris Peruzzi, who identified that this industry, the CBD industry, is evolving just like the so-called nutraceuticals or the natural products industry had evolved and continues to evolve. And so we look to that for guidance. So if you can look for patterns and you can identify analogous opportunities and analogous industries, there are things you can learn from that. And luckily, the kind of clients that we've always worked with are open to that. They're not the kind of people that necessarily come in and say, I'm going to do this one way and that's it. I just need your legal support. They wanted us to be involved in not just providing legal services, but also being industry experts to provide some perspective of what's going to happen next, again, reflecting on those patterns that we've always recognized. So there are ways to look. And, as this becomes globalized, we start to look at other products that were put into international commerce through different regions of the world that had regulatory uncertainty. And how can we use those patterns? Because that's the thing, is when you're dealing with government agencies that are regulating you as an industry or a business, you have to speak their language. You can't just come in and say, this is something brand new and here's how we're going to do it. You have to be able to place those regulations in a language or in a lane that they already understand, so that they're fair to you and so that you're responsible to them as regulators. And that's what we've been able to achieve thus far on a pretty wide scale.
One thing that activists or people who are working in that capacity have sometimes gotten is they get one form or another of the statement that, we don't know enough about the science, or there isn't enough science to back this or that up. And in some cases, I think what they're saying is we don't have American science. It just seems like American politicians want to be able to point to American studies. Is that a thing that you've encountered at all?
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to learn what you don't want to know, right? And that seems to be exactly what's going on out there. Is there are studies, hundreds, if not thousands of studies, and there are websites that house these studies. In fact, our own federal government has a web link that links to cannabinoid studies from all over the world. But in all fairness to the scientific method, most of those studies are anecdotal, or they're not exactly what we would call clinical in setting, although they are valuable to set the table for what these products can do and what these cannabinoids can do. And of course, the great Raphael Mechoulam out of Israel sort of took that to a whole nother level early on in his career. But in the 90s, we started to see some more rigid science become applied that was recognized by American scientists. But, we're still talking about a medical school system in the United States that doesn't even teach their physicians or their soon-to-be physicians about the endocannabinoid system, perhaps the most impactful and sensitive system in the human body. And that's not quack science, not even by a long shot. Unfortunately, when you go to your family practitioner, and I've had this conversation with mine periodically when I go in for a twisted knee or something like that with my children, and they say, "Oh, Mr. Hoban, I know what you do for a living, and I really take exception that you call it medical marijuana." And then you enlighten them, and you say, "You should look at this, and you should look at that," and they say, "I had no idea." So again, a lot of it is ignorance. That's why education is so critical for that component. But yes. We're Americans, so the only thing Americans respect is Americans that do things very well. So we have to Americanize, for lack of a better way to put it, the science and the technology. And of course, the Schedule 1 designation for this plant, for marijuana at least, has been a major impediment for that over the years. So it's an imperfect situation, but we see improvement, and that improvement began with President Obama's policies allowing at least a pathway for folks to apply to encourage more research surrounding this plant. And that's moved forward under the Trump administration, although not as robustly as we would like.
Is your doctor kind of open to the possibilities now? Like, where are you at with him on that conversation?
Well, it's a great question. And the idea is doctors, most doctors tend to be conservative, right? A plus B equals C. And if you're telling them A plus B equals D, or A plus B plus C equals D, that just throws off their notion of what they've learned and how science progresses. And, as a lawyer, I'm a bit limited in my understanding of science, but at the same time, they've come around to say, well, listen, I've tried that CBD, or I've recommended this, and we've seen, anecdotal success in, older patients using CBD for joint relief, as they walk and on their shoulders and things of that nature. Not the complete buy-in that you'd expect if they really looked at the science, but the idea that this is a viable alternative therapeutic. And that is, in fact, I think that's what Nancy Pelosi called it the other day when debating whether,
Right.
The coronavirus can be addressed by the use of cannabis. And at a minimum, as long as we can make progress now with educated practitioners understanding that it is a viable alternative therapeutic, if not a cure and a treatment for various specific conditions, we have made progress. And that's saying something, because science doesn't change on a dime as much as we as an industry would like it to.
And that's really, I think, that marks a pretty remarkable pace in sort of the larger conversation from our elected officials. It's worth mentioning here how carefully one needs to tread until there is real science. And now we're hearing Nancy Pelosi talk about it. So I just think that's kind of notable.
I mean, think about that for a second, though, Jesse. You're talking about something that was identified as a Schedule 1 substance that everybody learned forever. This was going to make you forgetful. It was going to make you lazy, and all these stereotypical things that, yes, those impacts are true in some people. But what we know that the science does support is that this plant, however cannabinoids are ingested, and varying degrees of success and varying ways of ingesting the cannabinoids, that it actually produces healthful impacts in the human body. That's truth is something you stumble into when you think you're going someplace else. And I think that's what these people are looking at. They're not. It's not intuitive, and they've been indoctrinated. Even if the smartest, most rational thinkers have been indoctrinated to think something else about this plant. So it really is eye-opening. And, we saw that with Sanjay Gupta when he turned his mind around on this with the whole Charlotte's Web story in the background. But claims, let's make no mistake about this either, claims are irresponsible on any of these products. And that's not an intuitive thing for folks that operate in this industry. Yes, this plant might help with condition X, however I consume it on a regular basis. I don't doubt that. You don't doubt that. The science would actually support it. But that doesn't mean you can make a claim. And, I go back to when the FDA was soliciting input 2 or 3 years ago about how maybe it should consider regulating CBD. There were folks in the industry across the board saying, this is our medicine, and don't prevent us from having access to our medicine. Well, that's not the right message. That's not the right message for the FDA, because if they hear medicine, they're going to regulate it as medicine, when in reality, in lower, less concentrated doses, Americans should be available to get safe, consistent access to these products for use however they want, under the guise of self-medication, even though it truly is and has a medicinal impact. So those are some of the things that we struggle with as an industry. And, unfortunately, sometimes I'm not people's favorite person when I say things like that, because they're sitting back saying, but Bob, this is medicine. I'm not saying anything against that for a second. I've seen it with my own two eyes, with my mother, so forth and so on. But at the end of the day, that's not the message that policymakers need to hear, because when they hear medicine, it means, well, let's turn it over to the people that make medicine. And that is not exactly what consumers in the marketplace want. And it's probably not the best way to produce efficacy on a commercial product coming from the cannabis plant.
I guess I love this theme that's kind of popping up about, language and just how we talk to each other. And so I'm curious, I've heard you talk about the fact that companies outside of the cannabis industry, other goods and services, have come to you for advice. And it sounds like you guys are having conversations where they're curious about including CBD or cannabis potentially in their products, whether it's food. I've heard you talk about toothpaste and beer and pet products. What are some of the conversations? What are some of the questions that these companies have? And what is their interest level like in cannabis?
Well, their interest level is off the charts. There's not a company out there that doesn't look at this and say, we have to do at least internal significant R&D on these products. And they're sort of waiting and seeing. Now, most of these companies that produce either consumer packaged goods or, personal care products or food products, most of these companies are large, multinational, oftentimes publicly traded companies. So their ability to take on a risky, unregulated topic and put those products into the marketplace is somewhat limited. And I would also note that most of these situations don't come to the law firm specifically, but it comes to the Gateway Proven Strategies. Our GPS is our sister firm. It's a consulting firm that we started years ago, which is a separate and distinct business for purposes of providing non-legal professional consulting services in this space. So they come in and they say, for example, using the toothpaste example, we'd like to examine a formula whereby we put cannabinoids into our toothpaste, because we understand that cannabinoids can prevent gum inflammation or gum bleeding, which is common in such a large percentage of people just on a day-to-day basis. And then you begin to talk about the regulatory and the legal landscape. Well, cannabinoids are not regulated affirmatively by the FDA yet. So there's some gray area there, and it would be a major risk for you, major personal care product producer, to put that product into the marketplace. If you'd like to do that, we can develop a strategy for you to mitigate or minimize, or at least understand the full breadth of that risk. And usually the response is, we'll keep that in mind, but what's the safer way to do that? And we've advised, to your point about the different industries, the different products, all of those products, we've advised major companies that you'd all recognize and said, there's a safe way to put hemp into the product without having enriched levels of cannabinoids in there, because the studies would seem to indicate that consumers want hemp products. Yes, they're fascinated with CBD, but they want hemp products because it's a new supply, a new ingredient. And their studies would seem to support that. And so hemp seed oil is one of the easiest ways to enter into that part of the marketplace. It's always been approved by the FDA. It's always been recognized as something called GRAS, generally recognized as safe, as a supplement ingredient. And it's something you can put into a product just like you could sugar or flour or anything else that would be recognized as a food product. So there is a way to mitigate that risk. And these companies, make no mistake about it. In fact, some of the largest retailers in the world that have dabbled in this space in a limited basis, mostly with cosmetics, but putting some end caps with CBD products and the like, And then you've got Constellation Brands, who's looking at, psychoactive THC products over the long haul once prohibition is lifted. So a lot of these companies are positioning themselves for when the regulatory certainty exists, because it's too much of a risk as a publicly traded multinational company with, frankly, leadership that really doesn't understand these minute distinctions in this space. It's too much for them to take the risk and put either psychoactive, which is very risky and frankly illegal in most markets, or non-psychoactive cannabinoid products into the marketplace. So they defer to, let's have a soft entry. Let's put some hemp oil or some hemp seeds into our product, bill it as such, and then when we get that regulatory certainty, then we come into the marketplace and we say, now we're positioned, about this one. Now this is a product that's enriched levels of cannabinoids or the like. So it's a soft entry into the market, if you will, to go with just hemp derivatives versus enriched cannabinoids.
And if companies got that regulatory approval to move forward, how quickly do you think we would see store shelves suddenly just overwhelmed with, a CBD version of almost every product?
I think very quickly. Think about this. It's not apples and apples, but you remember the name, the Atkins diet?
Yeah.
The Atkins diet was very popular. I think it's still around, but at the end of the day, that became all the rage. And you saw just about every kind of food product or supplement begin to identify itself as an Atkins diet compliant product or material. And again, it's not a great example, but that happened so quickly. In 3 to 6 months, we saw this logo with Atkins diet on so many different products across the marketplace. That's just a scratch of the surface as to what we're going to see with CBD, when you can put it in every beverage and every snack and every food product. And it's not going to be for everybody, but certainly there is a lane for that. And then this begs the question of, ultimately what's before us is, how the heck do you regulate those products on a national and global scale? Because there has to be some uniformity. If I'm putting cannabinoids into a food product, it's because in some part, those cannabinoids are interacting with the human body and causing some sort of impact. Well, that impact can't be deemed medical. In other words, it can't treat or address a specific medical condition, but rather it just makes that product perform better. If it's a sleep aid with melatonin, if you put CBN in it, that melatonin sleep aid product's probably going to perform better. But ultimately, cannabinoids need to find their home, and I would suggest very strongly that that home is as an ingredient. And when it's an ingredient, you'll see those things, CBN, CBG, CBD, so forth and so on. Those ingredients will proliferate, because you see this with products now. You see, what's the ingredient of the day for a hair product? It's shea butter. Or ingredient of the day for a beverage, it's acai or something like that, right?
Sure.
The of CBD and these other cannabinoids is, as genetics evolve, we'll start to see concentrations of other non-psychoactive compounds that will be introduced. And when you put a product like that into the hands of marketers do what marketers do, and people buy products because marketers tell them to buy products. So that's ultimately what's going to drive this, for better or sometimes for worse.
So one of your first big sort of notable accomplishments, specifically in the law area, was back in 2009 with the Cannamart case. Can you walk us briefly through what happened in that particular situation?
Yeah, that was a really fun case as far as lawyering goes. So the Cannamart case is what we call it. The case was called Frazier versus the City of Centennial, and Mr. Frazier and a few other plaintiffs were folks that used cannabis under our constitutional provision that allowed for the production and non-criminal use of cannabis for medical conditions. And this case had an impact on multiple levels. First of all, we walked into a courtroom against the City of Centennial when Centennial shut down the business called Cannamart at the time. They're now called Silver Stem, a great sustaining dispensary chain here in Colorado. But Cannamart opened up, and they opened up with a medicinal setting, with a medicinal business plan. It was a very clinical environment. And the place right next door to Cannamart was a woman who was the former lieutenant governor of the state of Colorado, running for Senate, or at least a primary for Senate at the U.S. level. And she was a Republican. So when she saw that, she was not very happy, and she went to the government officials and said, "What is this doing in this building?" And that started to create an issue about zoning. This business was never specifically zoned or authorized to operate in this district. And we said, well, wait a second. We went out and we found zone districts that mirrored what this business is: a clinical setting, a medicinal environment, a therapeutic, alternative therapeutic, so forth and so on. And they said, no, this doesn't exist. It has to be specifically zoned for marijuana. And we said, well, that's silly. And we went out and we argued that the fact of the matter was that was in our Colorado state constitution, that caregivers, so this is the distinction, caregivers and patients. Caregivers were given rights under our state constitution to this is not a quote, but to basically manufacture, produce, and distribute medicinal cannabis and medicinal cannabis products. So Cannamart, in this case, was acting as a caregiver. They had registered patients that they would provide medicine for, not the least of which were Frazier and Mr. Mosier and some of the other folks in that case. And they basically said, nope, we don't buy it. You're not allowed to have it. Well, we said there's a constitutional right at stake here. And if there is a constitutional right, there must be an outlet to exercise that right. That's U.S. Supreme Court case law that came out of the First Amendment that basically authorized adult use bookstores, for example. Freedom of speech was your First Amendment right. And then how can cities ban adult bookstores? Well, they can't, because it's an outlet to exercise that freedom of speech. So we went down that road and we said a caregiver has to exercise its right, or has the right to exercise those provisions in the Constitution as a dispensary. And the court agreed with that analysis. And the court said that, yes, indeed, this is protected under the Constitution, and that this business cannot be shut down based on zoning grounds. You can regulate the time, the place, and the manner in which it operates, but you can't say that it cannot operate, and ultimately begged the state to create regulations. So that is what caused the state legislature to take a keen interest in early 2010 in regulating for the first time on a commercial level the marijuana industry, and also caused a number of politicians to take a close look at who patients were. This was not a bunch of 22-year-old kids faking their identity as a patient to consume legal cannabis. These were military veterans. These were people with specific conditions that used cannabis on a regular basis because it was a viable alternative to the opioids and these other addictive pills and psychotropic pills that were prescribed that. And people saw that very quickly. And that was a major educational experience for our legislators. And that kind of spun through the nation, legislature by legislature. And again, the Sanjay Gupta revelation is kind of indicative of that. But when we won that case on December 30th of 2009, first time in U.S. history where a court told a city that it could not shut down a marijuana business for being a marijuana business because it was allegedly federally illegal, which of course it is, but that couldn't be the basis. And then we took that legal argument into multiple other jurisdictions with success. And then that's what also caused our law firm to begin expanding into other states, because other businesses, other governments wanted to get in on what's this argument, why did that stick, and how can we anticipate that? And that was just an extraordinary time. But that was a can of worms that got opened, and we've seen it expand across the world now, which is something I'm very proud of.
So I've only got a few more minutes with you. I'm going to try and sneak in like two quick questions here if I can. Building on that, this is probably going to be like a frighteningly basic question, but I guess when it comes to specifically the entire concept of businesses needing to be licensed within the cannabis industry. I mean, we could talk about the social equity implications for who's benefiting off of the industry. We could talk about the impact on businesses and individuals who are trying to get in the industry, and the financial cost to them and burden that may or may not ever be, without ever having any guarantee to get in the industry. We could talk about so many different factors when it comes to this. But I guess the question that I want to ask is so basic, which is just, what is the justification for businesses needing a license, and why do states feel that they need to do things this way?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And this actually frames the debate because, some of these folks that have dedicated decades and decades of their life through organizations such as NORML, Students for Sensible Drug Policy and so forth, and the Drug Policy Alliance, so many different groups and so many dedicated people had advanced this as public policy. And the notion was that this should be as free as tobacco. In other words, regulated, but not regulated to the extent it is today. Now, unfortunately, we live in a regulated state, and that is the United States of America. And regulations have become uniform throughout the world. It's sort of the fourth branch of government that nobody really ever talks about is the regulatory agencies, the bureaucracy, which is not in the Constitution, but it's the de facto state of how businesses of all sorts are regulated, from environmental protection issues to oil and gas companies, all the way down to cannabis. Why does it need to be regulated? Because that is the way to give policymakers comfort. Now, that might not be a proper way to answer that question. Give policymakers comfort is what we should agree to do. But when you're taking something from the dark and bringing it into the sun, like this industry has become, from an illegal substance to an essential business these days, you had to make compromises. So you needed legislators, elected officials, agency bureaucrats to buy in. And the only way that they would buy in was to have a tightly regulated industry. This also got the attention and the quote unquote buy-in from your average people who don't use cannabis. And working in this industry, you kind of have this misperception that everybody uses cannabis, but you and I both know that's not true. The numbers, somewhere around 20% of the American public. So that's not a huge number. So people that don't understand cannabis didn't know, honestly, whether this was akin to, heroin or cocaine or something else that was really terrible for society. And they had a hard time believing in the medicinal benefits, at least up front. So you had to create tight regulations. And some of the early movers that we were involved with in Colorado, and some of the other early movers in other states, voluntarily agreed to avail themselves as an industry of intense or strict regulation, because it created that buy-in. Over time, will the scrutiny on the industry lessen? Will the strict regulations loosen up? I believe so. I think we're at 90% of Americans believe today that some form of legal cannabis should exist. And there's lots of different, fractions within that 90%. And that cuts across party lines. But, that wasn't the case even 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. So you needed public policy maker, government buy-in, and you needed middle America, or, soccer mom buy-in, if you will. And you don't always get that. But the way to get that is to say, as a government, we're watching everything these folks do, and we're making sure that it's not getting into your children's hands, and we're making sure that these businesses are operating properly. So was it a deal with the devil? I don't think it's that bad, but I also think that the industry voluntarily took on additional regulation because it saw the need to get that buy-in so that it could open up on every single corner. And make no mistake about it, local governments around the country have the what we would call plenary authority. In other words, it's fundamental to them that they can regulate the time, place, and manner of every kind of business that operates within their jurisdiction. States have that same power. Sometimes it's a dual system. So the manner is really the question. How should a dispensary, for example, work? What check marks, what procedures and protocols need to be in place? These are basic government powers, particularly in something that has, gone from criminal and into the light. So that's a mouthful, but that's really why regulations are just so essential. I hate to put it this way because, I'm a libertarian from my political philosophy. But America is based on a regulatory foundation. And that would drive so many people nuts to hear, but there are so many examples of it in society that you had to play the game to get that recognition and acceptance. And we haven't gotten it completely everywhere, but we've made tremendous, tremendous strides as an industry to get that recognition, that buy-in, that trust. And because of that, states that you never would have thought are opening up to regulated cannabis are opening up to it. And over time, that will loosen up as well. When liquor stores first opened, they didn't have the onerous check-in protocols of a marijuana dispensary, for example, but they weren't as loose as they are today, where you and I can just walk in, and look at things, even if, we're not 21 to be able to purchase it. So things loosen up over time as society recognizes that this plant is not the devil's lettuce, so to speak, that it's been painted as for so long.
Bob Hoban is the president and founder of Hoban Law Group. Bob, thank you so much for taking the time to explain that. I know you called it a mouthful, but to me, it was really, really eye-opening, and I hope it will be for other people too, because I think I heard two things in there, which is that in some ways, these licenses and regulations are a reassurance, because to sort of create a metaphor out of it, they really do function as kind of an on-off switch, or at least like a toggle that allows people who may be concerned or nervous about how all this is going to work to kind of, in some ways, control the flow and at least say we have a handle on this. On the other side of it, it does kind of mean that when states talk about the failures of their social equity programs or how they want to do better, they also kind of just can. Is that fair to say?
Certainly. This is the thing is, if you really look at government behavior over the years, it's really gotten expanded to the point where government regulations affect everything. And, again, not to be political here, but the second largest slashing of regulations in our lifetimes was under the Trump administration, and it started with the Reagan administration. And I'm not talking about, political alliances. I'm just talking about a recognition that detailed regulations have been stricken in some areas that we don't want them stricken, in other areas where we say they should be stricken. But the idea is that if you have regulations in place and the ability to regulate the secondary piece, not what the law says, this is legal or this is not, but how do you implement the oversight and the licensing and the social equity programs that are part and parcel. Think about this. Colorado's had legal cannabis for many, many years now, and we're only getting around now to a social equity program, recognizing the responsibility the industry has to folks that have been incarcerated or underprivileged minority groups, for example. So those things are extremely important, and governments can require those, just like governments can require a balance of diversity in a workplace, or a balance of different legally recognized groups in certain settings. So that is something that is part and parcel of governmental powers, and you hope that the government uses that properly. Here, we've seen governments take on cannabis regulation. Some, for example, in Colorado, they were very proud to say that they were government regulators with guns. In other words, these were former law enforcement personnel that went to the Department of Revenue. Whereas in Washington State, for example, when that unfolded, these were business bureaucrats that were used to just, walking you through a process, being your friend to help you license it. And you have everything in between. So there really is no uniform way that the industry is regulated. The words on paper are meaningful, but how they're interpreted in practice is really what sets the tone for how that industry operates and what its possibilities are. And as this gets bigger, as we approach more, big marijuana, quote unquote, which people are fearful of, and wary of, and we should be to a certain extent, we need to understand it's those regulations that at least create some semblance of a level playing field that allows smaller operators to exist, that allows folks with diverse backgrounds that might otherwise not have opportunities to have a chance. And those things are, while they're contrived public policy measures, they are necessary, particularly when you look at the history around this plant.
Bob Hoban, president and founder of Hoban Law Group. Bob, thank you so much. I know you got to go, so thank you for your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'd love to do it again. And again, thanks for your time today.
You can find more cannabis industry reporting at TRICHOMES.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at highground@TRICHOMES.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at TRICHOMES.com and following us on all social media. The High Ground is produced by David Fortin. I'm Jesse Batend. Thank you for listening.